close on Clara Voss, standing at the entrance of a crumbling stone mill. Dust and broken glass cover the floor beneath her feet. She holds a rusted iron key pressed in both hands against her chest. In the background, wind pushes through shattered window frames, and the slow, mournful creak of rotting wooden beams fills the silence like a warning. They called her the fool's widow. When Clara's husband Raymond died, nobody in Harlow Creek mourned for long. He had spent the last of their savings on a condemned stone mill sitting at the edge of a dried-up creek, a crumbling, forgotten ruin that hadn't ground a single grain of wheat in over 40 years. The kind of property that real estate agents didn't even bother listing. The kind of place that the town had voted twice to demolish and twice forgotten about, because it wasn't even worth the cost of tearing down. Everyone said Raymond had lost his mind, that he had thrown away their entire future on a pile of rotting stone and rusted iron, and now Clara was standing alone inside it, 64 years old, a retired schoolteacher with a modest pension and an enormous grief, holding nothing but a rusted key, a dead man's secret, and a town full of people already betting on how fast she would fail. What those people didn't know, what nobody in Harlow Creek could have imagined, was that Raymond Voss had never once done anything without a reason, and that locked mill on the edge of the dry creek bed wasn't a ruin at all. It was the most powerful piece of property in the entire county, and Clara was about to find out exactly why. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Ann Voss was 64 years old when Raymond passed, and in the 4 days between his death and his burial, she learned precisely what kind of town Harlow Creek really was beneath its polished southern charm. Raymond had always been a quiet man, an engineer by training, a thinker by nature, and someone who had never once sought the approval of his neighbors. For 37 years of marriage, he and Clara had lived simply in a modest 2-bedroom house on the eastern side of town. Raymond had worked as a structural engineer for the county, a man who understood buildings and land and water better than most people understood their own backyards. Clara had taught 6th grade at Harlow Creek Elementary for 3 decades, shaping the minds of children whose parents would later look down on her at her husband's funeral. They had been happy, quietly, completely, deeply happy. They had no children, but they had each other, and for Raymond and Clara Voss, that had always been more than enough. They read books together in the evenings. They took long drives through the Tennessee hills on Sunday mornings. They argued gently about small things and agreed passionately about the ones that mattered. It was a life built on trust, and trust, Clara would later say, was the most valuable thing Raymond ever gave her. Then, 25 years before his death, Raymond did something that Harlow Creek never forgave him for. He took every dollar they had saved across 2 decades of careful, disciplined living, $31,000, and he bought the old Sutton Mill. The Sutton Mill had been a landmark of Harlow Creek once, long ago. Built in 1887 by a man named Elias Sutton, it had operated as a grain mill for nearly half a century, processing the harvests of local farms and serving as an economic anchor for the community. But when the creek that powered it began to dry up in the 1940s, a slow, decades-long retreat of water that geologists attributed to upstream changes in land use, the mill had lost its purpose. Elias Sutton's descendants had tried everything to revive it and failed. By the time Raymond Voss bought it in the late 1990s, it had been abandoned for over 4 decades. The stone walls were cracked, the wooden interior had rotted, the great wheel that had once turned on the force of rushing water sat frozen and silent, half buried in dried mud. The land around it, 3 acres of scrub brush and rocky creek bed, was considered completely worthless. When Raymond brought the deed home and showed it to Clara, she had looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she had looked at her husband, this quiet, brilliant man she had married, and asked him one simple question: "Do you know what you're doing?" Raymond had smiled in the way he always smiled when he was certain of something that no one else could yet see. He had taken her hand and said, "I do," and Clara had believed him. She had always believed him. The town, however, was not so generous. Within a week, everyone in Harlow Creek knew what Raymond Voss had done with his life savings. The whispers started at the grocery store and spread to the church pews and the diner booths and the folding chairs at town council meetings. "Poor Clara," people said, shaking their heads. "Married to a man who throws money into a dried-up creek. What a waste, what a shame." Raymond never responded to any of it. He simply drove out to the Sutton Mill every weekend in his old pickup truck, spent long hours there alone, and came home dusty and quiet and somehow satisfied. Clara packed him lunches and asked no questions. She trusted him. That was the deal they had made without ever putting it into words. She would trust him completely, and he would never give her reason to stop. For 25 years that arrangement held, and then Raymond's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in October, and Clara was left alone with a rusted key, an old deed, and a town that had already begun circling. The funeral was held on a grey Friday morning at Harlow Creek Baptist Church, and Clara sat in the front pew and counted the hypocrites. She didn't mean to. It wasn't a cruel or bitter thought. It was simply the truth presenting itself clearly, the way truth sometimes does when grief strips away the comfortable fictions people wrap around ordinary life. She watched the men and women of Harlow Creek file past Raymond's casket with their lowered eyes and soft voices, and she recognized the performance for what it was. These were not people mourning Raymond Voss. These were people relieved that the strange, quiet engineer who had bought the worthless mill was finally, officially out of the picture. The condolences came in waves, and most of them carried a blade hidden inside the sympathy. "At least now you can put that awful property behind you, Clara," said Margaret Holt, squeezing her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Such a sensible woman. You'll know what to do." From Pastor Green. Raymond was a good man, even if some of his decisions were unconventional. "I hope you find peace now, Clara. Real peace." And from Dorothy Aldridge, wife of Frank Aldridge, who owned half the commercial real estate in the county. "I'm sure Frank will be in touch, dear. He's been wanting to help with that mill situation for years. Raymond just never let anyone help him." Clara smiled at all of them. She thanked them quietly. She accepted their casseroles and their hollow promises and their barely concealed eagerness, and she said nothing about the rusted iron key she had found in Raymond's desk drawer 2 days after he died, sitting inside a small envelope with her name written on the front in Raymond's careful, precise handwriting. She hadn't opened what was inside the envelope yet, not fully. She had seen the key, and she had seen the 3 words Raymond had written beneath her name on the envelope, "Trust me still," and she had put it back in the drawer and closed it and wept for an hour. She wasn't ready, but she was getting there. Dean Whitmore came to her house on the 5th day after the funeral. He didn't wait for an invitation. He knocked twice, and when Clara opened the door, he was already smiling the way men smile when they believe the outcome of a conversation is already settled. Dean was 51, broad-shouldered, and wore the particular brand of confident friendliness that powerful men in small towns develop over years of getting exactly what they want. He ran Whitmore Development Group, the largest property development firm in the county, responsible for 3 luxury housing estates, a private fishing resort on the northern lake, and a commercial strip along the main highway that had swallowed up 4 old family farms in the last decade. "Mrs. Voss," he said, stepping inside without being asked, looking around her living room with the casual assessment of a man calculating square footage. "I wanted to offer my personal condolences. Raymond was a character. We'll miss him." Clara doubted that very much. "I also wanted to be straightforward with you, because I think you deserve that," Dean continued, settling into the armchair across from her sofa as though he had sat there 100 times before. "The Sutton Mill property. I'd like to make you an offer, a serious one." "I see," Clara said. $25,000, Dean said, clasping his hands together with the satisfied air of a man presenting a gift. "That's significantly more than the land is worth on paper. Raymond paid 31 for it, I know, but that was sentimental. The structure is condemned. The creek is dry." "There's nothing there, Clara. I'm offering you 25 out of respect for Raymond and because I'd like to see you comfortable." Clara looked at him steadily. "Raymond paid $31,000 for it 25 years ago," she said. "And you're offering me 25. Dean's smile held. "The property has depreciated. That's just reality. But I'm being generous here because you want it," Clara said simply. A flicker of something crossed Dean's face, not quite irritation, more like recalibration. "I'd like to develop the area, yes. We have plans for the Eastern Creek Corridor, a boutique resort concept. But the Sutton property sits right in the middle of our planned footprint, and with it in private hands it complicates." "I'll think about it," Clara said. Dean's smile tightened by a fraction. "Don't think too long. The offer has a shelf life, and frankly, maintaining that property, even just paying the taxes on it, is going to be a burden you don't need on a teacher's pension." I'm trying to make this easy for you." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left his business card on her coffee table like a man accustomed to leaving things behind that people were supposed to pick up. Clara sat alone after he left and held the rusted key in both hands. Raymond had spent 25 years at that mill. Dean Whitmore wanted it badly enough to show up 5 days after a funeral. Those two facts, sitting side by side, told Clara everything she needed to know. She booked a truck for the following Monday. She was moving in. The drive out to the Sutton Mill on Monday morning took 11 minutes from Clara's front door, but it felt like crossing into a different world entirely. Harlow Creek's main streets gave way to narrower roads, then to a single crumbling lane that wound through overgrown fields and scrub forest before opening onto the 3 acres of rocky, brush-covered land that Raymond had quietly owned for 25 years. Clara pulled Raymond's old pickup truck. She had kept it, over the gentle suggestions of several neighbors that she sell it, to a stop in front of the mill and sat for a long moment with the engine running, looking at what her husband had left her. The Sutton Mill was built of gray Tennessee limestone, quarried from the same hills that surrounded it, and despite everything, despite 4 decades of abandonment and neglect and the slow, patient assault of weather and time, the walls were still standing. That was the first thing Clara noticed. The mortar between the stones had crumbled in places, and vines had worked their way into the gaps, and the wooden window frames had long since rotted away, leaving dark, empty openings like hollow eyes. But the walls themselves, 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rose to the roofline, were solid. Raymond had always said that the men who built things in the 19th century built them to last. Looking at those walls now, Clara believed him. The rest of the picture was considerably less encouraging. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern side, and through the gap she could see the interior exposed to open sky. The great millstone wheel that had once dominated the building's eastern face was frozen in place, its wooden paddles rotted down to bare iron brackets. The creek bed that ran alongside the property was dry and choked with 20 years of accumulated debris, fallen branches, silted mud, the occasional rusted remnant of old farm equipment. The small stone bridge that had once connected the mill to the far bank of the creek was cracked down the middle, its 2 halves tilted toward each other like a broken argument. 2 wooden outbuildings that had likely served as storage stood collapsed and flat on the ground, their timber frames dissolved back into the earth. Clara got out of the truck, pulled on the work gloves she had brought, and walked to the mill's main entrance. The heavy wooden door had swollen in its frame and warped beyond closing or opening through normal means. She found a rusted crowbar in the back of the truck, one of Raymond's tools, kept exactly where he always kept everything, and worked at the frame for 10 minutes until the door gave way with a sound like a ship's plank splitting. She stepped inside and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was vast and cold, and smelled of stone dust and old wood and something else underneath, something mineral, like water hiding just below the surface of dry ground. Shafts of gray light came in through the empty window frames and the collapsed section of roof, illuminating floating dust and the remnants of what the mill had once been. The great millstone, the horizontal grinding stone, 4 feet in diameter and nearly a foot thick, sat on its mounting platform in the center of the room, untouched and unmoved, as though waiting patiently for work that never came back. Iron gears and drive shafts connected to the external wheel mechanism were still in place, corroded but intact. Wooden grain chutes descended from the upper floor at angles, most of them still connected to their mounting points, though the wood itself was gray and splitting. And everywhere, on every surface, in every corner, Clara found evidence of Raymond. His footprints were not there in any literal sense. Time had erased those, but his presence was written into everything she looked at. Rust scraped away and covered with protective coating, joints reinforced with careful patches of mortar, iron mechanisms sprayed with lubricant that had long since dried but had clearly been applied with knowledge and intention. A drainage channel cut into the floor along the western wall, too precise to be original construction, directing the seepage of groundwater toward a stone culvert in the corner. Raymond had been maintaining this building for 25 years, not restoring it for appearances, maintaining it for function. Clara stood in the center of the main floor, beneath the collapsed section of roof, and felt the familiar pressure of despair nudge at the edges of her composure. She was 64 years old. She had no construction experience, no significant savings, and a pension that covered her basic needs with nothing to spare. The building around her was, by any reasonable assessment, a ruin. The land was dry and scrubby and worth nothing. She had no plan, no allies, and a town full of people waiting for her to fail. She reached into her jacket pocket and closed her hand around the rusted key. Then she heard Raymond's voice, clear as creek water in her memory from a conversation 15 years ago when she had asked him why he kept going back to that mill every single weekend without fail. Because some things only reveal themselves to people who show up, he had said. Most people quit before the answer arrives. I never quit. Clara put the key back in her pocket, walked to the truck, and started unloading her belongings. Clara spent her first night in the Sutton Mill, sleeping on a camping cot in the northwest corner of the ground floor, the only section of the building where the roof remained fully intact and the stone floor was dry enough to be livable. She had hung plastic sheeting across the empty window frames to block the October wind, set up a battery-powered lantern on an overturned crate, and eaten a cold supper of crackers and tinned soup while listening to the building settle around her in the dark. The sounds were extraordinary. Groans and ticks and the low moan of wind finding its way through gaps in the masonry, and for the first hour she lay awake cataloguing every one of them, mapping the building by its sounds the way a blind person maps a room by touch. She was not comfortable. She was not warm. She was 64 years old, sleeping on a cot in a condemned building in a dry creek bed in rural Tennessee, and by any external measure her situation was either desperate or delusional or both. But somewhere beneath the discomfort and the grief and the cold, Clara felt something she hadn't expected. She felt close to Raymond, closer than she had felt standing at his graveside, closer than she had felt in their house surrounded by his books and his coffee mug, and the particular indent he had left in the sofa cushion over 37 years. Here, in this building he had tended quietly and faithfully for 25 years, she could feel the shape of his thinking everywhere she looked. This place had mattered to him enormously, and that meant it mattered to her. On the second morning, Frank Aldridge arrived. He came alone in a silver pickup considerably newer and more expensive than Raymond's, and he stood outside the mill's entrance and called her name with the particular tone of a man who had never once considered that he might be unwelcome. Clara came to the doorway and looked at him without speaking. Frank was 60, lean and weathered, with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades reading land values the way other people read faces. He ran Aldridge Properties, the second largest development firm in the county, and his family had owned land in Harlow Creek for 4 generations. Clara, he said, looking past her into the mill's dim interior with barely disguised assessment, I heard you'd actually moved in here. I had to come see it for myself. It's true, Clara said. This is not safe, Frank said flatly. The roof is compromised on the east side. The floor could give way. You're a woman alone out here with no utilities and no help. This is not sensible. I'm managing, Clara said. Frank sighed with the practiced patience of a man accustomed to handling unreasonable people. I want to make you an offer, better than whatever Dean Whitmore put on the table, because I know he came to see you and I know what kind of numbers he throws around. He named his price, $40,000. That is a fair price for what this land is worth, which is almost nothing, he said. But I'm being generous because I respected Raymond and because I don't want to see you suffer out here unnecessarily. Why do you want it? Clara asked. Frank paused. Development potential in the Eastern Corridor. Frank, Clara said quietly, why do you really want it? Something shifted in his expression. The practiced sympathy dropped a fraction, and beneath it Clara glimpsed the calculation underneath. There are plans for the creek, he said carefully. Water management plans for the whole Eastern Corridor. The county is looking at revitalization of the creek bed, rerouting upstream flow to restore water to this section. If that goes through, land values along this stretch will increase considerably, and the mill sits at the center of that stretch, Clara said. Frank's jaw tightened slightly. It's a condemned building, Clara. It's not. Thank you for coming, Frank, Clara said. She stepped back inside. He stood at the entrance for a moment longer, then walked back to his truck. Clara leaned against the cool stone of the interior wall and thought very carefully about what Frank Aldridge had just told her without meaning to. Water. They were planning to bring water back to the dry creek bed, and the Sutton Mill, Raymond's mill, the mill he had tended for 25 years, sat at the precise center of the corridor that water would flow through. Raymond had known. He had always known. That was why he had maintained the wheel mechanism, kept the millstone mounted, preserved the iron drive gears. He hadn't been maintaining a ruin. He had been maintaining a future. Clara pulled the rusted key from her pocket and looked at it carefully for the first time. It was old, genuinely old, not just neglected, with a long barrel and an ornate bow. the kind of key made for a serious lock on a serious door. She had searched the main floor twice and found nothing it fit, which meant it opened something she hadn't found yet. She went back to Raymond's journals that evening and began reading from the beginning. Raymond's journals were kept in a waterproof canvas bag that Clara had found tucked behind the millstone platform on her second day inside the building. There were 11 of them in total, small, hard-bound notebooks with marbled covers, each one labeled on the spine with a year range in Raymond's neat engineering script. The earliest dated back 24 years, beginning just months after he had purchased the property. The most recent ended 2 weeks before his death. Clara had brought them back to her cot that evening and started at the beginning, reading by lantern light with a blanket across her shoulders and the Tennessee wind pressing against the plastic sheeting over the windows. The early journals were dense with technical observations, measurements of the stone walls, assessments of the structural integrity of the roof timbers, calculations related to the mill's original water wheel mechanism and what it would take to restore its function. Raymond wrote the way he thought, precisely and without ornamentation, but even through the technical language, Clara could feel his excitement in those early pages. He had found something in this building that thrilled him, and he was working methodically toward understanding it fully. There were sketches of the mill's floor plan, annotated with dimensions and notes about original construction methods. There were detailed drawings of the millstone and drive gear system, and there were repeated references, appearing first in the third journal and then with increasing frequency through all the ones that followed, to something Raymond called simply the lower chamber. Confirmed today that the original construction included a basement level, he had written in what Clara calculated was about 18 years ago. Access point is concealed beneath the millstone platform, exactly as indicated in the 1887 survey document I found in the county archive. The concealment was intentional. Elias Sutton apparently did not want casual visitors finding their way down. The lock mechanism is original to the construction. I have the key. Clara sat up straighter on her cot. She read the passage again. Then she got up, took her lantern, and walked to the millstone platform. She had examined this platform before, a raised stone base about 12 inches high and 6 feet square, on which the great grinding millstone rested in its iron mounting bracket. She had assumed it was simply structural, a foundation for the weight of the stone. But now she looked at it differently, crouching down and running her hands along the base with the lantern held close. On the northern face of the platform, near the floor, she found what Raymond had found, a seam in the stonework that was not a crack but a joint, deliberately cut, running in a clean rectangle about 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, and at the right side of that rectangle, almost invisible beneath a thin crust of accumulated grime, a keyhole. Clara's hands were not entirely steady as she took the rusted iron key from her pocket. She inserted it into the lock. It met resistance. 25 years of disuse and oxidation had stiffened the mechanism, and she applied steady pressure the way Raymond always applied pressure to resistant things, patiently and without forcing. For a long moment nothing moved. Then, with a deep grinding click that resonated through the stone platform and up through the millstone itself, the lock released. The panel swung inward on iron hinges that Raymond had clearly kept oiled because they moved without sound. Behind it, stone steps descended into darkness, and from below came something Clara had not expected at all. Not silence, not the smell of stagnant water or dead air. From below came the distinct, unmistakable sound of moving water. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Clara descended the steps slowly, one hand on the rough stone wall, the lantern held ahead of her, its light pushing back the darkness one careful step at a time. The stairs were narrow and steep, worn smooth in the center from generations of use, and they went down further than she expected. She counted 17 steps before the stairwell opened and the ceiling lifted, and she stepped into a space that stopped her breath entirely. The chamber was large, larger than anything she had imagined finding beneath a rural Tennessee mill. It was roughly circular, perhaps 25 feet across, with a vaulted brick ceiling that rose to about 14 feet at its apex. The walls were Tennessee limestone, the same gray stone as the mill above, but laid with a precision and care that spoke of master craftsmen working with serious intent. The floor was smooth-cut slate, level and solid despite being over 130 years old. The air was cool and clean, moving gently in a way that suggested hidden ventilation, and it carried the smell of water, fresh, mineral, alive, and the water was there. Clara swept her lantern beam around the chamber and found the source of the sound she had heard from above. The chamber had been built at the precise point where 3 underground springs converged. She could see them entering the room through carefully constructed stone channels in the floor, 3 distinct streams of clear water flowing in from different directions, each one moving with purpose and energy. They were not trickles, they were genuine springs, running strong and cold and clean, feeding into a central collection basin built into the floor. A circular stone pool about 8 feet across that gathered all 3 streams and channeled the combined flow through a large iron pipe that exited through the southern wall. Clara crouched beside the collection basin and dipped her fingers into the water. It was shockingly cold and perfectly clear. She could see the slate bottom of the basin as though looking through glass. She lifted her fingers and tasted it, clean, pure, completely alive. She stood and looked around the chamber with new eyes, because she understood now, with sudden and complete clarity, what she was looking at. This was not simply a basement. This was not a curiosity or a historical footnote. This was the reason Elias Sutton had built his mill here in 1887, not because of the surface creek at all, but because he had found these springs. 3 underground springs converging at this precise point, providing a water source that was entirely independent of rainfall or seasonal variation or anything that happened on the surface. The surface creek had dried up 40 years ago and taken the mill's apparent reason for existing with it. But the springs had never stopped. They had simply been waiting, hidden beneath the abandoned building, flowing faithfully into their stone basin and out through their iron pipe into where? Clara followed the exit pipe with her lantern beam to the southern wall, and then she found the brass plaque. It was mounted at eye level on the wall beside the pipe's exit point, its surface green with age but its engraved text still perfectly legible. When Clara wiped it clean with her sleeve, she read it once, then read it again, her lantern held close, her heart beating in a way that she felt in her entire body. Sutton Springs Waterworks. Established 1887 by Elias Sutton, founder. These springs supply fresh water to the municipal infrastructure of Harlow Creek Township via the Eastern Underground Conduit. All water rights, operational authority, and maintenance responsibility are vested in perpetuity in the legal owner of this property and its associated improvements. No municipal, commercial, or private entity may access, redirect, or interrupt this supply without the express written consent of said property owner. Clara read it a 3rd time. Then she sat down on a stone bench built into the chamber wall. The same kind of bench, she realized, that a keeper would need during long hours of monitoring the flow. And she stayed there for a very long time, in the cold, clean air of that underground chamber, listening to the sound of 3 springs singing quietly in the dark. Raymond had not left her a ruin. Raymond had left her the water supply for the entire town of Harlow Creek. And every development, every resort, every luxury property that Dean Whitmore and Frank Aldridge and Victor Crane had built in this county ran on water that flowed through pipes connected to this chamber, through her chamber, under her mill, on her land. The widow of the locked mill had just found the key to everything. Clara spent the next 5 days in the underground chamber learning everything Raymond had left her to learn. She found his maintenance log mounted in a waterproof case on the eastern wall, a thick leather-bound ledger recording every inspection, every flow rate measurement, every adjustment he had made to the spring chamber over 25 years. She found technical drawings sealed behind glass showing the complete underground pipe network that carried water from these 3 springs through the eastern conduit beneath Harlow Creek and into the municipal distribution system. She found a secondary chamber off the main one containing replacement iron fittings, valve handles, and pipe sections, all carefully labeled and organized with the systematic precision that had defined Raymond Voss in everything he did. And she found, tucked into the final pages of the most recent journal, a sealed envelope with her name written on the front in Raymond's handwriting. She sat on the stone bench beside the spring basin and opened it with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the particular emotion of receiving something from a person who was no longer there to hand it to you. "My dearest Clara," Raymond had written, "if you are reading this, you have found the chamber, which means you trusted me enough to stay. I always believed you would. I want you to understand what you have inherited. These 3 springs have supplied Harlow Creek's municipal water system continuously since 1887. The town's infrastructure, the county's development corridor, every resort and estate and commercial property that has been built in this area over the last 40 years, All of it runs on water that flows through our land. I kept this quiet because I knew that if the wrong people discovered what this property truly was, they would find a way to take it. They have the money and the influence to do exactly that. But they cannot take it from you now because you know. Knowledge is the only protection that cannot be stolen. Use what I have left you wisely, fairly, and without cruelty, but do not let anyone diminish its value or yours. You were never the quiet schoolteacher they thought you were. You were always the woman I knew. I love you completely and without reservation, Raymond. Clara folded the letter and held it against her chest and wept in the clean, cold air of the underground chamber for a long time. Then she dried her face, stood up, and began preparing for what was coming. She did not have to wait long. On the 9th day after moving into the mill, 3 vehicles came down the lane simultaneously: Dean Whitmore's black SUV, Frank Aldridge's silver pickup, and a third vehicle belonging to Victor Crane, who ran Crane Commercial Holdings and had developed the county's largest private resort on the northern lake. Victor was 63, silver-haired, and carried himself with the specific authority of a man who had never in his adult life been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. The 3 of them had apparently decided that a coordinated approach was more efficient than individual visits, which told Clara that her refusal to sell had rattled them more than they had shown. They stood outside the mill's entrance and called for her. Clara came to the doorway, leaned against the frame, and waited. Dean spoke first, his earlier friendliness entirely absent now. "Mrs. Voss, we've been patient. We've made reasonable offers, but we need to be honest with you about something." "Please do," Clara said. "That mill is sitting on municipal water infrastructure," Victor Crane said, stepping forward. "The spring system beneath it is technically public utility property. The county has grounds to claim eminent domain over this land. We're trying to help you avoid that outcome." "Are you?" Clara said. It was not a question. "We're offering you a combined purchase," Frank said. $60,000, all 3 of us together. That's more than double what Raymond paid, and it's considerably more than this property is worth by any reasonable assessment. Clara looked at the 3 of them for a moment. "You've done your research," she said. "You know about the springs." The 3 men exchanged glances. "We know the property has some historical relevance to the water system." "Don't," Clara said quietly. The word landed with a weight that silenced Dean mid-sentence. "Don't manage me. You know exactly what those springs supply. You know the eastern conduit runs directly from this chamber into the municipal distribution network. You know that every property you have developed in this county for the last 20 years has been drawing water that flows through my land. And you have known for months that your own legal counsel cannot find a pathway to eminent domain because the water rights documentation from 1887 is ironclad and fully recorded in the county archive." The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms permanently. Victor Crane's expression shifted from authority to something Clara recognized as the early stages of genuine alarm. "You've been to the archive," he said. "Raymond's journals are very detailed," Clara replied. She looked at all 3 of them steadily. "I also want you to know that I have partially restricted the flow on the secondary eastern conduit, the one that serves the Whitmore Lakeside Estate and the Crane Resort northern wing. Not enough to cause immediate damage, just enough so that your facilities management teams are probably already noticing reduced pressure this morning." Dean's face had gone the color of old plaster. "You can't." "I already have," Clara said, "and I want you to understand something clearly. I am not doing this out of anger or spite. I am doing this because the 3 of you came to my husband's funeral and treated his life's work as an inconvenience to be purchased cheaply and quietly. And now you are standing on my property threatening eminent domain proceedings against a 64-year-old widow. So I want you to feel, just briefly, what it is to have something essential taken from you without warning." She let that sit for a moment. "When you are ready to have a real conversation, not an offer, not a threat, but a genuine negotiation conducted with mutual respect, you know where to find me." She stepped back inside the mill and closed the repaired wooden door behind her. Through the narrow gap of the window frame, she watched the 3 most powerful developers in Harlow Creek stand in the dry creek bed in absolute silence and slowly walk back to their vehicles. Clara put the kettle on her camp stove and made herself a cup of tea. Raymond would have smiled at that, she thought. He had always believed that the most powerful thing a person could do in a difficult moment was make tea and think clearly. She was doing both. The legal attempts came first, as Clara had known they would. Dean Whitmore's attorneys filed a motion with the county asserting that the spring chamber and its associated pipe network constituted public utility infrastructure and therefore fell under municipal jurisdiction, regardless of property ownership. Clara's attorney, a quiet, meticulous woman named Ruth Sampson, whom Clara had found through Raymond's personal address book, which suggested Raymond had anticipated needing her, demolished the filing in 11 days. The 1887 water rights documentation was not merely suggestive, it was among the most clearly written property rights instruments Ruth had encountered in 30 years of practice. The language vesting operational authority in the property owner was absolute and had never been legally challenged, modified, or superseded in over a century. The motion was dismissed without a hearing. Then Victor Crane went to the county commissioner's office and requested an emergency infrastructure assessment of the Sutton Mill property, arguing that the spring chamber posed environmental and public safety risks that required immediate government intervention. The assessor came out on a Tuesday morning, spent 2 hours examining the property, and submitted a report finding no environmental hazard and no safety risk beyond the partially collapsed mill roof, which was contained entirely within the property boundary and posed no threat to neighboring land or persons. Victor's intervention had accomplished nothing except alerting the county assessor to the existence of a remarkably well-preserved piece of Victorian water infrastructure, which the assessor mentioned enthusiastically to the county historical preservation officer, which set in motion a chain of events that would prove deeply inconvenient for the developers and enormously useful for Clara. Frank Aldridge tried a softer approach. He sent his wife Dorothy, the same Dorothy who had offered empty condolences at Raymond's funeral, to visit Clara with a fruit basket and an invitation to lunch. Clara accepted the fruit basket graciously and declined the lunch with equal graciousness and did not open the door to any further discussion. She was not being cruel, she was simply clear, and clarity, she had discovered, was a quality that people who were accustomed to managing others found profoundly disorienting. Throughout all of this, Clara kept the secondary eastern conduit partially restricted, not dramatically. She was not trying to cause genuine damage or hardship to ordinary residents whose water supply ran through the same system. She was precise and careful about it, restricting only the lines that served the developer's commercial properties, and only enough to create persistent, costly inconvenience. Dean Whitmore's lakeside estate reported chronic low pressure. Victor Crane's resort North Wing had recurring issues with its irrigation system. Frank Aldridge's newest residential development had drainage inconsistencies that his engineers could not explain or resolve from their end. The three men were hemorrhaging money on assessments and repairs that fixed nothing because the source of the problem was not on their properties at all. 6 weeks after their confrontation at the mill entrance, Dean Whitmore returned alone. He came on a Wednesday morning without his SUV. He had borrowed a plain sedan, Clara noticed, as though arriving in something less conspicuous might soften the significance of the visit. He knocked and waited. Clara made him wait 90 seconds before opening the door. She had timed it deliberately, not out of petty satisfaction, but because she had decided that the terms of every interaction from this point forward would be set by her, beginning with something as small as who waited for whom. Dean came inside and sat where she indicated he should sit. He looked around the mill's ground floor. Clara had made substantial progress on the interior, clearing debris, patching the worst of the structural damage, making the space genuinely habitable, and something in his expression acknowledged what he was seeing, not just the repairs, the permanence of them. Clara was not camping here temporarily, she was building something. "I came to apologize," Dean said. The words came out with the particular difficulty of a man not accustomed to producing them, but they came out whole and without qualification, which Clara respected. "For how we approached you after Raymond died, for the assumptions we made about what you knew and what you were capable of. We were wrong." "Yes," Clara said, "you were." "We would like to propose a proper contract," Dean said, "a service agreement that compensates you fairly for maintaining the spring chamber and ensuring consistent water supply to the eastern conduit. We've had our people assess what the service is genuinely worth to our combined properties, and we're prepared to offer accordingly." He placed a document on the table between them. Clara looked at it without picking it up. "What figure?" "45,000 per year," Dean said, "plus a maintenance fund of 15,000 annually for infrastructure upkeep, controlled by you." Clara picked up the document and read it carefully from the first line to the last. She asked 12 specific questions, 4 of which Dean could not answer on the spot and had to note for follow-up. She requested 3 modifications to the contract language. She proposed a clause requiring 30 days written notice before any development project that might affect water demand on the eastern conduit, and she added a provision that the historical integrity of the spring chamber and its Victorian mechanisms would be preserved in perpetuity regardless of any future changes to the mill structure above. Dean accepted every modification without argument. He signed the final document with a pen Clara provided, and when he looked up afterward, there was something in his expression that Clara chose to interpret as the beginning, however reluctant, of genuine respect. Frank Aldridge and Victor Crane signed their portions of the agreement 2 days later, separately and without requiring further persuasion. The reduced water pressure on their properties was restored to full flow within 24 hours of each signature. Clara kept her word precisely, as she intended to keep it always. The restoration of the mill began the following month. Professional contractors arrived, paid for through the agreement's maintenance fund, and Clara supervised every decision from the positioning of replacement roof timbers to the choice of mortar for repointing the exterior stonework. She insisted on authenticity. The Sutton Mill was restored to its 1887 appearance as closely as materials and craftsmanship could achieve, with modern structural reinforcements concealed carefully within the historic fabric of the building. The great external water wheel was rebuilt using traditional methods and original specification timber. The millstone was remounted on its platform. The building became once again what Elias Sutton had intended it to be: beautiful, functional, and enduring. Clara moved her belongings from the camping cot to a proper bedroom on the upper floor and looked out through a restored window at the dry creek bed below and felt something settle inside her that had been restless since the morning she had read Raymond's letter in the stone chamber underground. This was where she was meant to be. This was what she was meant to do, and the man who had known that before she did had trusted her completely to arrive at it in her own time. 5 years after the day Clara Voss had pulled up to the Sutton Mill in Raymond's old pickup truck with a rusted key and a grief she wasn't sure she would survive, she stood on the restored front steps of the building and watched the morning light move across the dry creek bed below, and felt something she could only describe as completeness. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was present. Not pride, though that was there too. Something deeper and quieter than either of those things. The feeling of a person who has found the exact place they are supposed to occupy in the world and settled into it with both feet. The mill behind her was extraordinary. The restoration had taken 14 months and had been executed with a level of craftsmanship that drew visitors from outside the county, historians, architects, preservationists who had heard about the Victorian-era spring chamber through the County Historical Society and made the drive out to Harlow Creek specifically to see it. The exterior limestone walls had been repointed and cleaned until they glowed the particular warm gray of old Tennessee stone in morning light. The rebuilt water wheel turned again, not on the flow of the surface creek, which remained dry, but on a carefully engineered recirculation system that drew a portion of the underground spring flow up through a new pipe and released it over the wheel paddles in a continuous loop, so that the wheel that had been still for 40 years now turned again with a slow, steady dignity that Clara found deeply moving every single time she looked at it. The interior was transformed. The ground floor had been opened up and restored to its original mill function, with the great millstone remounted and the iron drive gear system connected back to the wheel mechanism so that the mill could actually grind grain again, ceremonially, primarily, but genuinely. Clara had found a local heritage grain farmer who brought wheat to the mill twice a year for a traditional grinding demonstration that had become one of Harlow Creek's most popular community events. The upper floor had become her living space, warm and simply furnished, with windows on all 4 sides that gave her views of the surrounding hills and the scrubby 3 acres of her land and the lane that wound away toward town. The spring chamber below remained exactly as Elias Sutton and Raymond Voss had left it, maintained now with professional engineering support funded through the service agreement. Clara descended the stone steps every single morning to check the flow rates and record them in the digital log she had created from Raymond's handwritten journals. She had hired a young water systems engineer named Priya Nair to assist with the technical maintenance twice a month, and Priya had become not just a professional resource, but something approaching a friend, the kind of thoughtful, precise, curious person that Clara recognized as sharing a certain quality of mind with Raymond. The money had changed Clara's practical circumstances completely. The combined service agreement paid her $60,000 annually, with the maintenance fund providing an additional $15,000. She had invested conservatively and lived modestly, and the accumulation over 5 years had given her a security she had never expected to have at this stage of her life. But the money, as she said whenever anyone asked her about it, was not the point, and had never been the point. The point was what Raymond had always told her the point was: stewardship, doing a thing correctly because it deserved to be done correctly, regardless of whether anyone was watching or applauding or offering payment. Dean Whitmore no longer arrived at her property unannounced. He called ahead, addressed her as Mrs. Voss, and waited to be invited in before sitting down. Frank Aldridge had sent her a handwritten letter 6 months after signing the service agreement, acknowledging that he and the other developers had attempted to take advantage of her and expressing what Clara chose to believe was genuine regret. Victor Crane had been slower to arrive at any visible humility, but even he had, at a County Development Association meeting 18 months after the contract signing, publicly credited Clara's stewardship of the spring chamber as essential to the Eastern Corridor's continued viability. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and acknowledgement from Victor Crane was, by all local accounts, roughly equivalent to a formal apology from anyone else. The town of Harlow Creek had transformed its relationship with Clara in ways that sometimes made her laugh quietly to herself when she thought about the women who had pressed her hands at Raymond's funeral and suggested she sell the worthless property and make her life comfortable. She was invited to every significant community event. Her opinion was sought on development proposals that touched the Eastern Corridor. The mayor called her personally when the county began preliminary studies on a possible creek bed restoration project, a study that, if it resulted in returned surface water flow to the creek, would increase the value of her property by an amount that made Clara's accountant visibly emotional every time it came up. One afternoon in early spring, a young man named Daniel Reyes came to the mill. He was 22, a civil engineering student at the State University, and he had written Clara a letter 3 weeks earlier asking if he might visit and learn about the Victorian spring system. Clara had written back and said yes. Daniel arrived with a notebook and a quality of attention in his eyes that reminded her so precisely of Raymond that she had to take a breath at the doorway before welcoming him inside. She took him down to the spring chamber and watched his face when he stepped off the last stair and saw it for the first time. His reaction was everything Raymond's must have been when he first descended these steps: pure, uncomplicated awe. He moved through the chamber slowly, touching nothing, looking at everything, asking quiet and intelligent questions that Clara answered fully and without condescension. He spent an hour below and emerged back into the mill with the particular glow of a person who has just seen something that has permanently expanded their understanding of what is possible. "Mrs. Voss," he said, standing in the middle of the restored mill floor with his notebook pressed against his chest, "did you always know this was here, under the mill?" "No," Clara said. "My husband knew. I trusted him." Daniel thought about that. That must have been hard, not knowing why he kept coming back here all those years. Clara looked around the mill, at the turning wheel visible through the window, at the remounted millstone, at the light falling through restored glass onto limestone floors that had been tended and abandoned, and reclaimed and restored over 130 years. "It was the easiest thing I ever did," she said. "Trusting Raymond was never hard. He had never once given me a reason to stop." That evening, after Daniel had gone and the mill had settled into its night sounds, the slow creak of the wheel, the distant movement of underground water, the wind in the Tennessee hills, Clara made her daily entry in the spring chamber log and then sat for a while on the stone bench beside the collection basin, listening to the 3 springs sing in the cold, clean dark. She thought about what she had been 5 years ago, 64 years old, a widow with a pension and a rusted key, and a town full of people waiting for her to fail. She thought about the first night on the camping cot and the despair that had pressed at her edges, and the choice she had made to stay anyway, to trust the man who had spent a quarter-century preparing a gift she didn't yet know how to open. She thought about what Raymond had written in his letter: "You were never the quiet schoolteacher they thought you were. You were always the woman I knew." She put her hand in the spring water and felt it cold and clear and relentlessly alive against her fingers, and she smiled in the dark. The locked mill had been a secret, the key had been a test, and the woman who had stayed when every reasonable instinct said leave, who had dug through journals and descended stone steps and stood her ground against men who believed their money made them immovable, had passed the test not because she was extraordinary, but because she had refused to let other people's certainty about her limitations become her own. The widow of the locked mill had become the keeper of Harlow Creek's oldest living secret, and she intended to keep it faithfully, justly, and with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had learned the most important lesson available to any human being, that what the world calls worthless is sometimes the thing that holds everything together, that patience outlasts power, that love, expressed as trust, is the most enduring inheritance one person can leave another, and that it is never, under any circumstances, too late to turn a key and find out what was waiting on the other side all along. Never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose and a key she hasn't used yet, because when she finally opens that door, everything changes. For her, and for everyone who thought they knew what she was worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.